Hello and welcome to today's LinkedIn Live program as we explore supply chain best practices brought to you by my friends at the Antares Vision Group, the real experts in supply chain and technology. Today we're talking about further strengthening the supply chain out to the edge and particularly in serialized products. Hello everyone, I'm your host Bill Wall, and I've worked in the enterprise software and data space for more than 20 years, and I'm ever fascinated about the intersection of technology and business. No matter what industry you work in, supply chain management is critical, and technology advances that we will discuss today are extending visibility deeper and deeper into the supply chain and how it impacts collaboration with customers, partners, and the players along the supply chain with new capabilities. I've been fortunate to cover the latest in technology deployed to address these critical issues out at the edge and into the core ERP solutions, and it continues to amaze me how best practices in supply chain can be addressed across a variety of industries. Today's conversation is also an interactive one. So if you're joining us today on the platform, I encourage you to participate. Use the platform to do a couple of things and give us your name, title, and where you're located so we get a sense of who is joining us today. And you can use that same comments area to post any questions you'd like to ask throughout our program, and we'll try to address them in the course of our time together. My most productive conversations on supply chain have been with my friends at Axis, now part of the Antares Vision Group, and it's my pleasure to always welcome a regular guest, Chief Strategy Officer John DiPaolo, to the program. John, so good to talk to you again.
Bill, always a pleasure to chat on this summer afternoon here.
I learn something more about supply chain every time we get together. So let's talk about product serialization. This is not a new concept, but certainly as supply chain technology has gotten more and more advanced, we now need to figure out how do we track serialized products all the way down to the saleable level. So let's first talk with the audience. What does that mean to track serialized products?
Well, Bill, it's interesting because for most companies, outside of probably the chip industry, it's been okay to track at the batch level, right, or even above the batch level, with just SKU quantity, and then customers can order those SKU quantity batch combinations, and we run that through the order entry system out to the warehouse management system. Product gets picked. Doesn't matter, individual items that are picked or not. Quantity gets sent out and the customer receives it. As we move into a serialized world, and it affects different industries differently, it becomes much more important to be able to track individual items as they move through the supply chain and report those appropriately, which does open up some new challenges for many traditional pick, pack, ship operations, receiving operations, and even things like the inventory management systems.
That makes sense. If I think about it, it seems natural for regulated industries like pharma. Where is most of the industry level focus on this topic?
Yeah, and pharma is a great example. We're now in the very, very final stages of implementing the DSCSA law, for supply chain security for prescription drugs. And what that law says is that you need to manage the chain of custody for saleable units across the entire supply chain. So from manufacturing, through distribution out into the wholesale market, and then ultimately when that product is dispensed. So that industry, certainly is the model for other industries, potentially to follow around track and trace, all the way down to the saleable unit level. We're starting to see different things, in food, not necessarily down to the unique item level, although we are seeing companies doing that for consumer engagement and other things. And ultimately, what I believe is going to happen, is we are going to have a more granular view of the supply chain so that people can start to leverage that information across marketing, across inventory management, across order accuracy, and a whole host of other things.
So this feels like a combination of a range of issues, from record keeping, tracking, auditing, meeting regulatory requirements, but it's also a pick and pack issue, right? Every one of the players in distribution has a role to play, both on the data side and just the practicalities of, I need these 100 items to go here, but I need to be able to prove where I sent them. And these really are a combination of business process challenges, right?
Absolutely. And there's a number of ways that I've seen the topic approached. In the early days of the DSCSA, and as companies started to implement serialization, the focus was heavily on manufacturing and packaging, right?
Mm.
So how do I get this serial number in a reliable way onto these products? And then there is also this concept of aggregation, where I'm taking, as an example, 24 units, putting those into a shipping container, sealing that up, putting that onto a pallet, and building that hierarchy so that you can move product like that efficiently, has been a challenge which a lot of companies have begun to overcome on the manufacturing space, right? So the focus was there. The challenge that we see is, in fact, in just what you said, right? What happens from the time that I receive a product into a warehouse, go through the pick, pack, and ship operation, where the mixture is completely different from how I received it, right?
Right.
So it's unusual in life sciences, as an example, that companies are buying full pallets of product, right? They're buying mixed pallets, even mixed totes, things of that nature. And with serialization introduced into that, it does add a bit of significant complexity in order to be able to do that.
For someone that doesn't live it to the level of detail, I'll ask I won't call it a dumb question, but in my head, if you have a pallet with 10,000 items, you can get information and scan the pallet to know what's in that pallet. But as soon as you break that apart, then how do those subunits, case, carry that data? And then ultimately, when you bust the case apart and send 10 items to a particular store, if you're a distributor, then all of a sudden, all of that structure starts to break down. You ultimately don't want the warehouse to have to scan 10,000 items on a pallet. You want them to do one scan and then carry all that data. So there really are a lot of challenges here to maintain the integrity of tracking these serial numbers. There, as we prepared for this program, I learned a lot about serialization systems, EPCIS. Those systems are clearly designed to do all of that, but warehouses are also running warehouse management systems, and manufacturers are running ERP systems. They've all got to figure out how to work together, right? That's where the challenge is real.
It certainly is, and at its core, what we're really talking about is a set of unique practices that have to happen in order to move that product, pick, pack, and ship that product. However, from a warehouse worker's perspective, it's one task.
Mm-hmm.
So the challenge is, how do I make it such that the movement process, the picking process, the packing process is intuitive enough so that it automatically adjusts to the task at hand, so that you don't have operators in the warehouse making decisions, being inefficient, slowing down. I'm not saying that you can manage serialized product at the same velocity that you can manage non-serialized product. That is not a reality. There is additional steps in order to be able to do that. Our thought process, and the key thought process that people who are listening to this need to think about, is how can I optimize everything about that process in order to limit the impact on operations? And then in the back of your mind, and we can talk about this a little bit later, how do I derive benefit from this new level of granularity that I have? And just to put a little bit of a wrinkle, into it, and we can expound on this one a little bit further, I have yet to come across an implementation that we have done, or anyone that I've talked to, where the product is not a mix of serialized and non-serialized, running through the same process.
So
And
if you're downstream from the manufacturer, say that you're at the distributor, the master distributor, they've got a warehouse full of stuff that has products that have to be tracked by serial numbers and products that don't carry serial numbers. And the picker and packer that's building a shipment is combining both types of products into a single effort. And the system's got to be smart enough to deal with that without it being too complex for to use your perspective, the average warehouse worker. That's what you're saying.
That's correct. And just as an example of that, I was in a very sophisticated warehouse, at a kind of one of the major major players, and they were shipping, to a chain store. So they carry everything, right? So they carry pharmaceuticals, they carry over-the-counter products, they carry greeting cards, and in this case, that we were watching, somebody pick product to a tote, and then at the end of that, walk over to a completely different area in the warehouse and put some cat toys into the tote to be shipped out to the chain store, right? So that was what they ordered. And if you have to think about, I need to change my process in order to scan, different products, or the system is not doing that for you, it just gets to be very cumbersome. And training becomes an issue, and SOPs become more complicated. And there's just a lot of additional labor that goes into
So,
managing.
so you're suggesting to our audience, John, that serialization of cat toys is not the solution to that problem?
Probably not. I think that we know that we're not going to live in a completely serialized world, and the adjustment, to a partially or mostly serialized world, is the reality.
So let's back up a couple of steps, though. From our many conversations, my career in technology started at SAP, so I have a sort of ERP-centric perspective. And when I first worked on supply chain solutions, the bottom line was everything goes into ERP. It becomes the master system of record. Why? I know that there are technologies dedicated to serialization. Why shouldn't that data and the serialization effort be part of the ERP system?
Yeah, that's a great question. When we look at ERP, even the most sophisticated ERPs, for the most part, they are built to deal with quantity batch, and manage it that way. When you add serialization into the mix, two things happen. First, the data that you're managing is exponentially larger, because we have each individual product serialized. The use of that information downstream, once that product has been shipped, is limited, right? So to put all of that into an ERP system, certainly would be challenging. The other part, which I think is super important, is these EPCIS systems are built to share information,
Mm-hmm.
right? So traditionally cloud-based, outside of the firewall. There are not a lot of organizations, in the world today that want to open up their firewalls to let data in and out of their ERP system to share them with other stakeholders, right? So the evolving, EPCIS, or electronic product code information system, really was built to share information across entities, and do that in a standardized format.
The goal, of course, is to have these systems manage all this complexity while presenting a relatively simple work process to the warehouse worker. But if we look at upstream, back to the manufacturer, who might have to conduct an audit to meet their regulated industry requirements, they're going to turn to their ERP system, which then has to ultimately talk to these serialized data management systems, and I guess to warehouse management systems, so that they can actually really create that chain of custody record that you're talking about.
Correct. And the key, to a well-designed solution is really to keep both of those systems in synchronization, right? So the act of moving product, the act of picking, packing, shipping product, at the right time, we're capturing the serialized data. That information gets routed to the EPCIS system. The business data associated with ERP gets routed to the ERP system. And what we want to avoid, is kind of the two-gun approach, which is, I have one system that I use for managing my ERP pick, pack, ship activities, and then I have another system that I use typically after the fact to scan out what serial numbers I've worked upon, right? So doubling the work in a lot of cases and making it challenging, for operational efficiency and accuracy.
Do we think about the warehouse management system then as a third layer? You've got ERP that starts at the manufacturer. You've got EPCIS that's managing serialization. Then downstream from the manufacturer, you gave an example of a well-known pharma distributor mixing serialized and non-serialized products. They have their own warehouse management system, which may or may not be related to the other two. There's really multiple systems at play here.
Correct. And all of that complexity, when you think about distribution, these are typically fairly high volume distribution arenas that we're talking about. So speed and accuracy and the ability to run quickly across multiple shifts is key. And we want the system to drive that entire process. So what we look for is an overlay solution that can tie all of those different systems together and do the updates at the appropriate time and make sure that everything is kept in sync while keeping the operators daily tasks in mind.
My sense is, knowing how technology tends to evolve, that where we are today is really good ERP systems, really good EPCIS systems, really good warehouse management systems. And in a lot of customers that you talk to, my guess is that they're just running really effective silos, but they are siloed operations. So the goal here, which is the reason we're having this conversation, is to figure out how to break down those silos, maintain best practices in the silos, but allow information flows across the top and behind the scenes that breaks down the silos so that you get a really effective business process for serialized products from manufacturing out to the edge.
Absolutely. And what tends to happen, in a lot of cases is if you try and shoehorn this type of a requirement into one of those systems, you come up with a suboptimal solution, right? As opposed to putting an overlay system on top and having it feed all of the different systems the information that it needs at the time that it needs it. And that way you can put a best practice approach to the transactional side of the house and also keep all of your systems, in synchronization without putting undue load on any one of them or a significant amount of customization, which is the other challenge, right? As I look at different systems in order to plug in this capability for serialized and non-serialized and workflow management, that's a lot of customization potential. And then we all know what happens to that, as we try and keep systems in sync and on the latest releases and things like that.
So we think about overlay systems that are ultimately sort of master integrators across both the business process and the data exchange. That's where you folks come in, right? You bring your expertise on supply chain best practices along with technology to create an overlay system that makes those very efficient silos talk to each other. That's where your edge systems play a role.
Correct. And the interesting thing, from my perspective, is we designed our initial edge system at the start of the DSCSA. So we're talking 10 plus years ago. And that's been refined, over those 10 plus years. And now, we were a little bit ahead of ourselves because everyone's focus was on manufacturing and packaging. But now as we enter in the reality of moving all this serialized product kind of through the supply chain, what I would call the legacy supply chain that now has to adapt for serialization, we are starting to see customers raise their hands and say, listen, I can't run this operationally. I don't have enough time in the day to be able to do multi-scanning and things like that. So I need to put some intelligence that will allow me to work as efficiently as possible in front of this serialized supply chain.
No supply chain is ever in one market. How complex does this become when you start to talk about global operations that cross country boundaries and different regulatory environments? Certainly with pharma, every country has a different approach. Are there emerging standards that make that easier, or is it as complex as it sounds?
So, certainly there are standards that are out there, and, you kind of look at the US, you look at the EU, look at various states, in various countries around the world, and they do have subtle changes and subtle variations in the serialization requirements. So it does get complicated. I've had conversations with manufacturers in India, in Europe, who export to the US as an example, and they have to follow a different set of rules than they do even in their own country, right? So the ability to adjust and change based upon what geography you're going into, obviously is key to the solution as well.
If we go back to the beginning of our conversation with just the simple concept of chain of custody for our audience, how far is the manufacturer's responsibility? They, of course, know what they've shipped to a distributor. The distributor can probably tell them where they then shipped the product to their the next line of distribution, and ultimately the next line of distribution may go right out to the store level. Is the manufacturer, under the current regulatory scenarios, responsible to understand, say, how one bottle of, I'll pick a drug, amoxicillin, where it ultimately wound up at the retail or pharmacy level, or are they just responsible to get it to that first line distributor?
And so they're responsible for their own chain of custody. So, from the time I receive it until the time, ultimately that I distribute it out to somebody else. Now, at the end of the day, the EPCIS layer can trace back, through the entire supply chain based upon, events that happen along the way. It would be very unwieldy for a manufacturer to have to say, okay, let me see where this individual unit was distributed, out at an end retail pharmacy. But at the end of the day, the goal of the DSCSA was to be able to do just that. So there are standards in place that are well written, that allow us to share information, and track those events based on the EPCIS standard. And that is very well understood at this point, and people are working well within those guidelines. Now we need to make the operations of all of those companies keep up with the demands that they now have in front of them.
Always these projects feel daunting in their complexity. We often, John, on these programs talk about, okay, if I'm a supply chain leader in a regulated industry, I've got my act together across the silos, but now I have to think about this integration across the top. Where are we starting? Are we at the edge working back? Are we starting from my loading dock as the manufacturer and working out to the next layer? What's your advice about how to get a project like this kicked off, knowing that you've also got a business, the client has a business to run. It's probably 24/7, fast paced. There's a lot going on there. How do you get started on a project like this?
Yeah, this one is an interesting dynamic because there's some other dynamics that come into play, especially in pharmaceutical regulated industries. But the way that we like to work is really taking a look, and we'll just pick, a manufacturing warehouse, and understand what processes do they actually do, right? How do they receive product from, packaging lines? How do they store it? How do they ship it? What are the exceptions to that? And if we can pick a representative location to do that mapping at, and then verify that mapping at other, locations, that works out very well, right? The other piece that, from a timeline, which needs to be thought about is, many of these are validated systems. So they need to go through the validation process in order for them to be able to be used within the life sciences industry. So being able to bring that validation capability and the proper paperwork and deliver that along with the system is obviously key to streamlining that particular process. But the good news is, at this point in time, the majority of companies, have an EPCIS that they are, publishing information into in one way or another. And now we are working on making that a streamlined operational excellence, that we can do. And the integration back into the ERP in order to make it a holistic system, I think, is one of the bigger challenges that we've seen, right? And how do we make that happen? Because ultimately, if you don't do it that way, you're still stuck in this siloed world of having one foot in the ERP, one foot in your EPCIS, and you're never going to get that operational excellence that you're looking for.
Anytime IT creates a layer over the top, there's a business case, and the business case certainly can be some combination of, well, we have a regulatory requirement we need to meet, or so forth. But often it's about the added visibility, transparency, auditability of systems. What are some of the wins that tend to come out of putting this layer in place? Because you can run really effective silos. We've talked about that on this program. The goal, though, is to create a positive outcome. What are some of those positive outcomes that people should expect from these projects if they're able to successfully deliver on them?
That's a great question. My first answer to that one is, when you think about supply chain and you think about the drivers and the metrics that we use, perfect order becomes a big metric, right? So I did a ship it on time with the right paperwork and the right product, and those kind of characteristics. when you sit back and think about it in a serialized world, if done correctly, it's impossible to misship product because the serialization is going to count the product for me. It's going to make sure I've got the right batch. It's going to make sure I've got the right product. And I can package that up, and make sure that I'm getting that perfect order out to my customer every single time. But the interesting dynamic that also can go on is you can really start to look at operational statistics at a much more high fidelity way.
Mm-hmm.
We actually have a customer that we worked with early in the process, and they had a number of different people that were doing picking for them, and they had one particular worker who was outstripping everyone else in the volume of product that he picked on a daily basis. When we finally sat back and looked at the data, it turned out that he was picking very high volume, low margin product very quickly, getting it out the door, leaving kind of the more complex picking operations, out, for others to do. And they wound up doing a lot of rush late shipments with those. So in a serialized world, we can start to think about looking at that volume of data and understanding, kind of at a minute by minute level, how are people picking? What are they picking? What product are we moving through the supply chain? So there's a lot of interesting, statistics and a lot of interesting KPIs that we can build around that information.
I was thinking about this program the other day as I was flying back, and I happened to be sitting in the seat looking out the window as they were loading baggage on the plane. And to a certain extent, for most airlines today, the analogy here, of course, is the guy at the bottom of the baggage belt who's got a little hand scanner and he's scanning bags. And when it's done right, it's beautiful. You can see your bag go up the conveyor, you watch him scan it, and then in your airline, in my American Airlines app, up pops your baggage has been located or loaded on the plane. The weakest link in that is that not that your bag doesn't get loaded, because that tends to happen, but when you're taking off and your bag doesn't seem to be loaded on the plane in your app, you're worried it's missing. And the weak link is that guy at the bottom of the baggage counter who sneezes or turns his back or greets a buddy and does not scan the bag, and chain of custody, if you will, sort of disappears. In a serialized world, what's the weak link? Is it the fact that the systems aren't talking to each other, or is a pick and pack person doesn't complete a scan or a process? Where are the weak links we watch out for in these kinds of processes?
Yeah, I think there are a couple. I mean, obviously, scanning every product, as it goes out the door, or scanning cases and getting that aggregation. Data challenges are definitely what people talk about today, right? So if I scan a case, are the 24 items in that case what actually are the 24 items, right? Because that has a ripple effect. So getting aggregation right, doing spot check, thinking of those types of things. The other weak link that we see is data timing. So if you're a distributor and you have a customer that's very close by, and you don't have a connected system operationally, and you don't create or update the EPCIS system, it's possible that shipment arrives before the message that says, I just shipped you these serialized items, and that's a big problem. So what we look to do again with this unified approach is, as the workflow happens, we're updating the systems appropriately. So if I do have a customer 5 miles away from my distribution center, when that shipment arrives, the data is there for it to be received. Because in today's world, no data is a big problem for receiving, serialized product. So that's just an example. There are many more that we can go through. I think we're a little short on time, but certainly would open it up for questions.
Well, that's great, John. This background is always fascinating and interesting. We build out these programs as LinkedIn Lives to give people a chance to get a taste of this. There's so much more information people can learn about. John, as always, great to have you on the program. Thanks for being such a great guest. I think we could do another entire program and dig even deeper on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill.
If you'd like to reach out to John or the great team at Antares, please use their LinkedIn accounts. I find that's a great place to get a sense of their thought leadership on these topics and more information. If you'd like to learn more about the Edge Supply Chain Solutions, you can find that on the Access website. That address is right up on your screen. You can see it there. My thanks to the great team at Antares Vision Group for bringing us today's program. And for that team and my friend John DiPaolo, I'm your host, Bill Wall. Please join the conversation online. Let's keep it going. We'll share the recording of this program. That'll be posted on LinkedIn shortly. And until the next time we speak, I wish you all a good day.